right. Well, I want to really thank Monell for the invitation to come here. I owe a tremendous amount to Monell. It really catapulted my career. I'm an otolaryngologist, and within otolaryngology, I dig in people's noses. And so what I'm going to kind of break ranks here, and I'm not going to talk about tough cells. A couple other people in my group later in the afternoon will talk about our work in tough cells in chronic sinusitis. But what I want to talk about is these chemosensory receptor cells that Bob was so instrumental in identifying. And then another collaborator, Danny Reed, has educated me over the last 15 years on the complex genetics of these taste receptors. And I want to take it to the last phase of what this symposium is about, where we're talking about tough cells and health and disease. And I want to tell you about some of the work that we've done with the implications of this chemosensory system in the manifestations of disease. So I need to kind of get you up to speed in regard to the disease that I take care of. Rhinosinusitis is a common disease, affects 16% of the population. It's a costly disease and getting even costlier as these drugs are becoming even more expensive. As surgeons, it keeps us very, very busy. Somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million surgeries in the country are done for sinusitis. The one point that I really want to drive home is that chronic sinusitis is the #1 diagnosis for the prescription of antibiotics in the adult outpatient setting. It is a big driver of antibiotic resistance, which is a big, big problem in this country and in the world. And so we need to do better with our antibiotic stewardship for this disease. And I'm going to kind of finish up at the very end about how we can leverage what we've learned in this project to avoid using antibiotics. And then the last thing is, from a quality of life standpoint, while chronic sinusitis doesn't kill you, it really makes your life suck. So you basically, patients with sinusitis score worse on quality of life for patients with CHF, COPD, and angina. Our management is conservative to start with, basically flush out the nose with nasal saline, steroids as an anti-inflammatory. If we have infection, culture-directed antibiotics. I don't know what's going on here. Something just got cut off here. We do that. That's supposed to say 4 to 6 weeks. There we go. And if there's persistent signs or symptoms, patients get referred into a rhinologist or an ENT, where we offer them a surgical intervention. And what that surgery entails is basically marsupializing the sinonasal cavity. We go in and we surgically remove all the little bony trabeculae that make up the labyrinth of the sinonasal cavity, such that if there's infection or inflammation, the mucus can still drain out. Okay, and so this was first described in 1985 by my mentor here, David Kennedy. And so this is a non-operated cavity. You can see all the little bony trabeculae. Surgically, we go in and we remove it, and it allows the egress of all the mucus. And I'm sorry, to give you the anatomy, this is the eyeball here, this is the palate, this is the nose, the brain is up here. Okay, so we try to stay within the real estate of the nose. We don't try to poke into the brain or into the eye, but we try to just marsupialize all this so that even if there's infection or inflammation, we can still clear things out. Over the last 40 years, this surgery is about 75% successful. And so one of the other motivating factors behind a lot of the work that we do in our group is to try to identify who is a good surgical candidate for this intervention. And if we can avoid patients who are not going to do well with surgery, well, we can increase those numbers. And in the current environment, what insurance companies are looking for are successful interventions. They don't want to pay for a surgery if it's not going to be successful. So if we can move that number from 75% successful to 95% successful, there'll be less of a hurdle to get approval from an insurance company. So that's the other thing that we're trying to identify, is who's a good candidate for this. Now, as a tertiary rhinologist, unfortunately, my practice is made up of all these patients that have been operated on and fall into the 25% of patients that don't do well. And so what you're looking at here is an operated nose. We're in the left nasal cavity. That's the left maxillary sinus right here. This is the sphenoid sinus. And while the sinus is wide open, it's not draining out these inspissated secretions. And I apologize for doing this after breakfast and before lunch, but at least there's another lecture after me so you can get it out of your memory before lunch. If we culture those secretions, comes back as Pseudomonas, pan-sensitive Pseudomonas. I can put this patient on any one of these antibiotics. While they're on the antibiotics, they get better. When the antibiotic course is over, shortly after that, the symptoms come back. And this is the same bug that Tom Finger and Wolfgang were talking about with regard to the quorum-sensing molecules. And we're going to tie it all up in a couple slides. If you biopsy the mucosa underneath this is what it looks like. It's just teeming with bacteria. And this is the morphologic and the clinical appearance of what's known as a biofilm. And over the last 30 years, we've come to realize that patients that grow out biofilms in their sinuses require more medical intervention, have persistent inflammation in their nose, and these are the patients that we'll keep operating on. Again, we're surgeons. So if someone comes into our clinic, we operate. That's what we do. Whether we make them better or not, we operate. So they have higher rates of revision surgery, even though they're not really getting better. And so the question that we were posing over the last 30 years is, are there patients out there that are predisposed to forming these biofilms, or is it random? Is it bad luck? Can we identify something that would tell me if a patient would form a biofilm, maybe I don't offer them this surgery? And to address this question, the experimental model that we use in our group is the air-liquid interface culture. And I should also stress that all the data that I'm going to show you today is based on human samples. There's no animal work here. And I'm going to also stress the differences between some of the mouse work and what we're finding in the human. So what we do is when we do these surgeries and we're removing all this epithelium from the nose, we take them back to the lab and we dissociate the mucosa and we get single cells and we plate them out on what's called a transwell. This is a plastic porous support. We grow these cells for a couple of days. They form a monolayer with tight junctions. We can aspirate the media from the apical side and get them fed from the basolateral side. And when they're grown in this air-liquid interface, it forces them to terminally differentiate into a ciliated epithelium, which looks something like this. So on the top right, on the top right, you can see by bright field microscopy beating cilia. Bottom right, you can actually see dead cells that have basically sloughed off, and you can see mucociliary clearance patterns. I don't know why it keeps flashing the green. Over here, you can see on scanning EM the motile cilia, and this is basically a crosscut. This is the plastic support, the pseudostratified epithelium, and the brush border. So based on work that Tom has already described with these gram-negative quorum sensing molecules stimulating basal solitary chemosensory cells, and then a paper that came out of Mike Walsh's lab, which is a big CF lab at University of Iowa, demonstrating that there were taste receptors expressed in the ciliated cells in the bronchus, we made the following observations. We demonstrated that the bitter taste receptor T2R38 is expressed in human sinonasal epithelium, and it's really enriched in the apical side of the cell and in the cilia. And here you can see on the IF, the column on the left is a biopsy right from a human nose, and the column on the right is those air-liquid interface cultures. In green is motile cilia, red is the T2R38, and you can see the overlap. And again, based on the work that was coming out of Tom Finger's lab with Marco Tizzano, we demonstrated that in the human nose, these gram-negative quorum sensing molecules don't stimulate the solitary chemosensory cells, but stimulate the ciliated cells through T2R38. And when this receptor is activated in the ciliated cells, it induces the production of nitric oxide. And in the airway, NO has two physiologic consequences. It increases mucociliary clearance, and it diffuses out into the airway, where depending on what organism you're looking at, it's either bactericidal or bacteriostatic. So to kind of wrap it up in one picture, these gram-negative bacteria come into your nose, you aspirate it, kid sneezes on you, they make their quorum sensing molecules, it's detected by T2R38, produces nitric oxide, it flies out, it diffuses out into the airway where it kills the bacteria, and because you've increased mucociliary clearance, you don't even have the dead bacteria around to be pro-inflammatory. So as many of you know, T2R38 is a member of all the bitter taste receptors in the human genome. This is all the stuff that Danny Reed has taught me over 15 years. There are about 25 genes encoding bitter taste receptors. These are G protein coupled receptors. And as we've already seen this morning, they're not limited to the expression in the tongue. They're found on most of our mucosal surfaces. I just showed you in the nose. They're found in the GI tract and the GU tract. The one thing that hasn't really been stressed, and I don't know if I have to stress it in this environment, is that there's tremendous genetic variability in people's ability to taste different bitter molecules. And on each one of the tables, I put out a little tasting strip to prove that point. And so at this point, I want everyone to grab one of these tasting strips and to put it on their tongue. And again, many of you guys have already done this. And by show of hands, who just tastes paper? Anyone taste something bitter? And I promise you it's the exact same tasting strip. I didn't mix in blank paper and peat. So what you guys just tasted was the molecule phenothiocarbamide. This is a synthetic compound. And over the last 100 years in the Caucasian population, it's been demonstrated that the ability to taste PTC or not follows near-classic Mendelian genetics. Within the Caucasian population, about 30% of individuals are PTC taste blind, 20% find it very bitter, and 50% are somewhere in the middle. And based on the ability to taste PTC, a group at the NIH in 2003 cloned the receptor and identified three polymorphisms that confer the ability to taste PTC or not. If you had a proline, alanine, and valine at the three locations, it was a functional receptor in the context of tasting PTC. If you had an alanine, valine, or isoleucine at these three locations, you basically had a non-functional receptor in the context of tasting PTC. 85% of the time, these three polymorphisms segregate together, so it's not random. And as I already mentioned, in the Caucasian population, it's a balanced polymorphism. In Asians, it's 30% non-functional and 70% functional, and in Africans, it's 10-90. So if you have two haplotypes, you have three genotypes. You basically are either homozygote functional, homozygote non-functional, or heterozygote. And what we wanted to know is whether the genetics that govern the ability to taste PTC also regulate the ability of this receptor in the node to detect these gram-negative quorum-sensing molecules. And so what we did is we genotyped all the patients that we were operating on, and we generated air-liquid interface cultures based on the genotype. And so here you can see air-liquid interface cultures generated from a homozygote functional, homozygote non-functional, and a heterozygote. And Rob Lee, who's going to be speaking this afternoon, was a postdoc in my lab, and so all these experiments were done by him. He loaded these cells up with an intracellular dye called DAF-FM, which fluoresces in the presence of reactive oxygen, reactive nitrogen species. And then we came in and we apically applied dose increasing concentrations of these gram-negative quorum-sensing molecules. So the top graph is C12HSL, the bottom graph is C4HSL. And you can see a genotype-dependent difference in the response with regard to this DAF-FM, where the homozygote functionals are starting to produce this intracellular fluorescence, and I'll show you in a couple slides that this is nitric oxide, at very, very low concentrations of these quorum-sensing molecules, and you maybe get a slight bump in the heterozygotes at much higher concentrations. I will tell you this, that at 100 micromolar C12HSL, the biofilm is already formed. This is before these biofilms form. So you get a differential response in the nasal epithelium at lower concentrations if you're homozygote functional for T2R38. Is this enough nitric oxide, though, to actually kill bacteria? And so what we did is we took our three different genotyped air-liquid interface cultures and we infected them with Pseudomonas for 2 hours. So we put Pseudomonas on the apical side of these cells, let the bacteria multiply, proliferate, secrete their factors, interact with the epithelium. And after 2 hours, we came in and we sucked the bacteria off with the mucus. We put them on a cover slip and we did a live dead stain. So in this experiment, any live dot at Cyto9 is a viable bacteria. Any red dot, Propydium iodine, is a dead bacteria. And this is the results of that experiment. So you can see on the far left column, these are the bacteria that got exposed to a homozygote functional culture. The vast majority of the bacteria are red, dead. The heterozygotes or the non-functionals, the vast majority of the bacteria are alive. If we take the same amount of bacteria, just let them sit in saline, that's the ceiling of the experiment. Our positive control is a great anti-pseudomonal antibiotic. Colistin gives us about a 95% kill. Look at how good a homozygote functional receptor does with regard to killing bacteria. It's almost as good as colistin. Here are the heterozygotes and the homozygote non-functionals, and if we take nitric oxide out of the equation by either blocking the enzyme with L-name or sucking up or quenching up all the nitric oxide intracellularly, we completely reverse that bactericidal activity. So this is really kind of interesting in the lab. Does this have any clinical significance? And so we went back and we reviewed all the microbiology reports on all these patients that we were operating on, and we binned them into two groups, either no-growth normal respiratory flora or patients that harbored gram-negatives in their nose. And the caveat here is we ignored a big population of patients that grew out gram-positives because we didn't really have a mechanism to explain gram-positive infection. We already had them genotyped for T2R38, and so Danny genotyped them for three other bitter taste receptors that have nearly the same frequency of non-functional alleles. Did I get that right? Of these patients to see if it was correlating specifically to T2R38. And this is what we found. So in the patients that had normal respiratory flora or no growth, equal distribution between our three genotypes. But in patients that actually grew out gram-negatives, we didn't find a single patient that was homozygote functional for T2R38 that we grew out gram-negative bacteria from their nose. So this is a small study, 56 patients, but highly significant in the context of T2R38 genotype and gram-negative sinusitis. I stress that one of the things that we're really focused on at surgeons is whether we can improve our outcomes. And so we were looking to see whether the T2R38 genotype played any role in our surgical outcomes. And we looked at 123 patients that we had done their primary surgery at Penn. And in rhinology, we're not as sophisticated as a cardiologist. We don't have ejection fraction. We don't have PFTs. We don't have LFTs. We have something called the SNOT-22. And this is a 22-item questionnaire that assesses the function of the nose. And what we look at with regard to our surgical intervention is the improvement in the function of the nose based on this questionnaire. And so we look at it 6 months after surgery, after the patients have healed up. And in order for the surgery, or for the patient to feel that the surgery was worthwhile, you need at least a 9-point improvement in this questionnaire. So in the 123 patients that we operated on, we had a 25-point improvement. So overall, we're doing pretty well. But if we break it up in the context of the T2R38 genotype, not much to write home about. Maybe the homozygote functionals do slightly better than the heterozygotes and the non-functionals. One thing that I've neglected to mention up to this point is that sinusitis comes in 2 flavors, pun intended, with and without polyps. And these, while they manifest with the similar symptoms of nasal obstruction, loss of sense of smell, facial pressure, they're very, very different histopathologic diseases. So without polyps is really that first video that I showed you. Purulent secretions, edema, osteomyelitis, neoosteogenesis. You can send the CT scan, you got air fluid levels, and this is predominantly a neutrophilic-driven disease. With polyps, it's not necessarily an infectious process. It's more of an inflammatory response. It's just gone amok and just gone crazy. And this is mostly these grape-like structures that fill up your nose, filled up with eosinophils. On a CT scan, you don't see any air in the patient's nose. And their main complaint is not really pain, it's the loss of sense of smell. If we look at our patients in the context of our surgical intervention, and we break them up whether they had polyps or not, we see a stark contrast. If you have polyps, it doesn't make a difference whether you can taste PTC or not. You do well with our surgery. We remove a nose full of grapes, you feel pretty good. In the patients that don't have polyps, though, T2R38, the difference in the genotype is absolutely driving this, right? So in the homozygote functional, they do exceptionally well with our surgery, a 40-point improvement. They're really, really happy they had the surgery. But if you're a heterozygote or a homozygote non-functional, you're barely above the minimal clinical improvement that the patients, I mean, we have about an 11-point improvement. Most of these patients are starting to say, why did I have the surgery? And I started off the talk saying that we are about 75% successful. So if you look at the amount of patients that are non-polyp, non-PTC tasters, that is, what's my number, 34? 34 over 123, that's 27%. So in this cohort, in the primary facet pen, we can actually identify who doesn't do well with our surgery. Non-polyp patients that are either heterozygote or homozygote non-functional. Now, since we published this original work, this has also been confirmed by several other groups, a group up in Montreal, in Poland, in Australia, in Charleston, South Carolina. There was one study out of Italy that refuted it, but 80% of their patients were polyp patients. So what about other taste receptors? So by mRNA, we've identified all 25 bitter taste receptors in the nose. Physiologically, here I can show you that T2R4 does the exact same thing, generates nitric oxide. So colchicine, which is used for gout or dapsone, an antibiotic, both taste bitter, activate T2R4, give us a dose-dependent increase in NO, which is T2R38 independent, same amount in the homozygote functional or non-functional, because it's not working through T2R38, it's working through T2R4. T2R16 does the same thing. So I'm going to end there, and I'm basically going to stress that, as we've heard already this morning, taste receptors are found at our mucosal barriers. The endogenous ligands are not things like Brussels sprouts or asparagus, but are bacterial byproducts. That there's an emerging role for these taste receptors in innate defense, and because of the timing of their mechanism of action, I would argue that the T2Rs are upstream of the TLRs. These things are supposed to respond not to the actual physical bacteria, but to the factors that the bacteria are secreting. So they're the front line of defense, and if they fail, then the TLRs get activated and you get inflammation. I demonstrated that the functional T2Rs on the ciliated cells may protect against non-polyp disease. And the real point that I want to stress here, and this I want you to think about through the rest of the day, is that these functional and non-functional polymorphisms and on the tough cells will all these different functions that we're learning for these chemosensory cells may contribute to why certain parts of the population get a certain disease and others don't. And the one thing that I really wanted to talk about, but I didn't have time, is can we leverage this? Can we leverage this ability to stimulate these taste receptors in the nose to make nitric oxide as a frontline therapy rather than antibiotics? And so with that, I just want to thank all of my collaborators, both at Penn and at Monell. And if I have time, I will take any questions. Thank you.